Welcome to our series on the mythological schools of thought, where we bring you the history of research into the ancient sources of the Teutonic mythos. Here we shall explore the evolution of mythic interpretation as it pertains to heathen belief, while demonstrating both the truths and the flaws within each school. We truly feel that by properly explaining the timeline of this research, we can help those of our faith to understand the necessity of moving beyond the academic lines and welcoming the true reconstruction of this belief. Our religion was subject to centuries of persecution, and as such, the documents that led to its revival originally ended up in the hands of those opposed to it. Once we recognize the flaws within their methods, we can begin to discern what can be of benefit to our community and what must be discarded. We are the epic school of mythological research, built around the method originally developed by Victor Rydberg in the late 19th century. From the very beginning of our school, we have always viewed the stories as part of a religious structure. The gods are not symbols, they are not fantasies, and they are not deified humans. The Norrøna Society has been working diligently for the past 25 years to develop Rydberg's method into a working body of sacred lore for our folk. This is our mission. This is our passion. This is our religion. In our previous video, we discussed the Euhemerist method as it developed through the ages, eventually landing within the Teutonic realms where it influenced the study of our mythology. We have demonstrated a lineage that evolved over centuries to eventually become part of Snorri Sturluson's Poetic Edda, and we have proven that this was a continuation of a propaganda method utilized by the Church. It is imperative for us to understand this lineage so that we can begin to develop a hierarchy of source material when researching and building our theories into the lore of our ancestors. By seeing the Poetic Edda as a secondary, Euhemerized source, one that cites the Poetic Edda as its primary reference, the research takes on a new light, which we will examine in a later video. For now, it is important for us to consider the validity of the heathen poetry and to debunk the ideas that have led to its degradation by academics, a degradation that began with the biblical school. By the time this school developed, Europe had undergone a drastic change within its cultural landscape. The Interpretatio and Euhemerist schools had firmly rooted themselves within Western civilization, and with them came certain biases against their ancestral beliefs, especially among academics and the elite. At its worst, these beliefs were viewed as a satanic impulse of their heathen past, or they were seen as barbaric and savage, unlike the Christian and classical pagan views that were allowed to proliferate as high culture. One example of such a view comes from the world of art, where serious debates took place on whether or not the Norse myths should be used as a theme. Many detractors came out against this, declaring that such motifs would destroy high art by allowing something that they considered grotesque. In Norse mythology, art will meet its grave. Everything that Norse mythology contains is misshapen, useless for fantasy. Among the items exhibited in the Museum for Nordic Antiquities, there is not a single one from the days of Nordic mythology reminiscent of fine arts. It is therefore impossible to imagine the artist thinking something else of our ancestors than that they were barbarians, and not a single artist who has his hands unbound would consequently want to occupy himself with them or their idols. This debate would rage on until the coming of a very important piece of art that would change the world: the opera of Richard Wagner and his use of Norse mythic themes within it. His Ring cycle became so popular that it changed the views of Europeans concerning their ancestral heritage, and the opera has never gone a single year without being performed somewhere in the world, even to this very day. But our purpose here is to discuss the attitudes towards the belief of our ancestors and how these affected the research into the ancient texts. It is a little-known fact concerning the documents of our lore that they were not part of an unbroken tradition, but were actually lost to us for some time. Although many of the texts are believed to have been compiled from the 10th to the 13th centuries, they were not discovered until around the beginning of the 1600s. The texts include Codex Upsaliensis, Codex Regius, Hauck's Book, Codex Wormianus, and others. When these discoveries were made, they were met with little fanfare and were only examined by a small band of Christian scholars who were now living in Iceland a full 600 years after the conversions. Christianity was firmly rooted into the European landscape, and only traces of the elder ways were even known. The earliest debates surrounding the discovery of the documents centered upon who their authors could have been. Many names were thrown around, and bizarre theories developed as to how the texts were divided, who came up with these divisions, and how the documents were organized. Eventually they settled upon Snorri Sturluson as the author of the Prose Edda, and Sæmund Frodi as the collector of the poems of the Poetic Edda, although the latter would eventually be proven false. Since at the time these scholars were entrenched within the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, they fully accepted euhemerism as an authentic historic model. Thus many of them believed that there must have been some form of Arch Edda, a document that was written down by the Aesir from Asia, and they also developed a fable about a woman named Edda, daughter of a king of Gautland, who was very wise and collected the stories of the Aesir into a magnificent text now lost to us. It would not be until the late 1770s that the Eddas would be translated into the world language. And by the time this took place, the texts were consumed with Christian interpretations of the source material based upon the euhemerized rationalizations they held onto. These interpretations would influence the development of the research into the myths and would be seen as a valid method of examination into their contents for centuries to come. So it is not difficult for us to see the evolution of a school of thought that would become the basis for scholarly research even into the modern era. Over a century later, the Teutonic nations would begin to experience what was known as the Germanic Renaissance, and people would once again feel pride in their native ancestry. This would begin a new era of research and examination into the sources of our ancestors, and would pave the way for the great authors of the time. Many would take up the mantles of philology, anthropology, ethnology, and mythology to begin unfolding the picture of how life was like in ancient pre-Christian times. As far as the Eddic material went, one of its first critical examinations would now take place under the care of Sophus Bugge, the founder of the biblical school. Sophus was a renowned runologist and philologist of the time, so his examination of the Edda was certainly going to be appreciated by the academic community. However, the poetry in what we call the Poetic Edda was at this time accepted as heathen in nature, and scholars began to develop a consensus as to its development as a native source. So when Sophus came out with his studies on the origin of the Nordic mythological and heroic tales, his theories would come as somewhat of a shock. He created a method of research completely lacking any scholarly foundation or line of proper research, instead utilizing spurious connections and hollow theories to develop the notion that all of these stories were borrowed either from the Bible or from classical mythology. My contention is that at the time when the mythological Eddic stories took shape, Norwegians and Icelanders were not uninfluenced by the rest of Europe, but that they were subjected, on the contrary, to a strong and lasting influence from the Christian English and Irish. Sophus built his thesis upon spurious biblical and classical connections, without first examining whether or not these connections were prolific, and whether or not a polytheistic model could be applied first. He utilized obscure Christian documents, such as the Toledolf Jeshu and Mater Dolorosa, to develop his theories, even though these were shown later to not have been known in Scandinavia at the time of the Eddas. His entire doctrine would be vehemently opposed and debated against, since it was built upon an obvious bias and would only serve to demonstrate that little to none of the ancient culture of the Teutons actually belonged to them, but was rather stolen from foreign influencers. No such assertion had ever been made against a people, nor has it been made since. The idea that the Teutons could never have created a higher philosophical belief is based upon a cultural bias that developed within the culture of the time. Their religion was seen as barbaric and savage, and therefore any idea that could be viewed as having a higher, more complex thought would have to have been borrowed from some other culture and could never have been indigenous to the people there. This idea permeates the biblical method and should be rejected simply because it is primarily based upon this bias, which is necessary for it to permeate. The fact that this school has had to utilize obscure texts and stretch itself to the furthest reaches of the imagination fully displays the obsession with placing all high civilization within the Mediterranean and Middle East. One of the greatest detractors of this school was the founder of the Epic School, Victor Rydberg, who broke down the many mistakes, biases, and falsehoods presented by both Bugge and A.C. Bang, the latter of whom wrote a treatise connecting the Eddic poem Voluspa to the Christian Sibylline oracles. Rydberg pointed out that many of the texts cited were unknown in the region at the time the biblical school places Voluspa, that the relationships made between the Eddic poems and biblical scripture were spurious at best, and that the authors even made errors in their own presentation of Greek mythology. Rydberg's refutation of the biblical school led him into developing his own theories concerning the mythos, which we'll explore in a later video on the Epic School. However, it is important to note here that the work he created in refuting the biblical method was so sound and resolute that Bugge himself conceded to Rydberg in a letter in 1887. I have read, and with every page my enthusiasm grows. I have been wonderfully taken by the rich, fresh images. I have read with happiness and in full agreement, surprised to find here combinations that in part have wound around in my own thoughts, but also, for the sake of truth, many times in disagreement, and inclined to make an opposite interpretation, for example with many applications of the principle of polyonymy. Forgive these words from one who, confronted with such a magnificent and in many respects important work such as yours, has realized that he is nothing more than a philologist. I deeply regret that your investigations arrived too late to have any influence on my final volume of mythological studies. Please accept my warm thanks for your work, which is more dear to me because you sent it with a friendly word. The fundamental flaw within the biblical method is that it relies upon the idea that the Eddic sources can and must be investigated by looking for hidden messages within the material and never taking them at face value. Comparisons to the Bible and classical stories must be made because an independent development is impossible in their eyes. They find a correlation and it must always equal causation. If a story remotely sounds like it might be biblical or classical, then it must be so. The idea is that the heathen composers of these stories were unimaginative plagiarists that did not have the mental capacity to create a mythos of their own, so they had to borrow from other, more enlightened cultures. The problem with this is that we do see poems and sources that did combine the two beliefs of Christianity and heathenism, but these were always blatant, such as with the euhemerized sources we have discussed previously, and with a poem such as the Solarjod. Here we shall show a heathen element within the poem, followed by a very blatant Christian element. I sat in the Norn seats for 9 days. Thence I was mounted on a horse. There the giantess's sun shone grimly through the dripping clouds of heaven. I saw those men who had given much for God's laws. Pure lights were burning brightly above their heads. Here you can see an actual blending of the two traditions, and in every single source outside of the Poetic Edda, when such a blending occurs, it is blatant and very well defined. This leads us to two conclusions. One, that the Poetic Edda is an indigenous heathen source that should be viewed as authentic, and two, that attempts to link it to biblical scripture and classical mythology have proven fruitless. In order to further demonstrate this, I would like to examine one of the primary theories that the biblical school has produced, in order to demonstrate how this method works and why the scholarly efforts to push it must be dismissed by practicing heathens. Here we shall look at the theory concerning the correlation between Jormungandr and Leviathan, a theory originally posited by Sophus Bugge in the late 1800s and maintained as recently as 1997 by Ursula Dronke. The comparisons are made between the story found in the Book of Job, when God fishes for Leviathan, and that of Hemiskvida, when Thor goes fishing for Jormungandr. When we break down the comparisons, the only similarities are that there is a snake being fished out of water. But we also see the same event in the Indo-European tale of Indra, whom it can be proven is identical to Thor, and who battles the serpent Vritra within holy waters. Beyond this, the biblical comparisons fall apart completely, for Leviathan is captured by the body of Christ, the Midgard serpent with the head of an ox. Jormungandr escapes Thor's fishing line, whereas in the Christian story the snake loses his power and remains suspended on the line. We are going to explore the Indo-European method of research in a later video, and explain how greatly effective it is in not only disproving many of the biblical theories, but also its superiority as a research tool into the greater mythos of our people. It should be understood that the development of a mythos from another is not in any way being discredited here, and that we shall review this development thoroughly from the view of Indo-European studies later on. There is certainly a line of thought that has grown from the most ancient times as part of the religious devotion of practitioners of various beliefs from the Vedic era down, and this is not to be dismissed. One thing that should be noted is that the biblical school has never presented the notion that the Poetic Edda was composed by Christians, but rather is the product of pagans that were heavily influenced by the influx of Christian ideas and texts. Many believe that they were put together by Christian monks that interjected their beliefs into the writings as they scribbled them down, but no evidence exists for this, and very few scholars have ever explained it as the basis for the Eddic canon. As we shall show in a later video, we must always consider the establishment of heathen views from heathen culture, from one polytheistic society to another, from a natural development of cultural mores within the structure of pagan belief. When monotheism was introduced into Europe, its sole purpose was to supplant and destroy the old ways, and therefore any peaceful coexistence between one model to the other must be rejected as simply devoid of any line of reasoning and as the product of modern biases towards the faith of our ancestor. In the late 1800s, Bugge's theories were primarily rejected and seen as an extreme example of the author's bias. Bang's connection of Voluspa to the Sibylline oracles was completely defeated. However, even though most scholars agreed that the biblical school was disproven, his theories have continued to permeate to today, developing into even more spurious and unfounded arguments towards biblical connections. Balder is a Christ myth. Odin hanging on Yggdrasil is the crucifixion. Ragnarok is the apocalypse, and so on. Documents have been altered, words have been given new meanings, and relations have been invented in order to force the original sources into this mold. For instance, the word Luther was changed from millbox to boat to turn the story of Bergelmer into a replica of Noah's Ark. When such fraudulent means are used to prove a theory, that theory must be thoroughly rejected by anyone seeking to restore the ways of our ancestors. The result of this has been the placement of the heathen poems of the Poetic Edda right alongside the clearly humorist, Christianized account of Snorri Sturluson. This has led many to believe that it is Snorri's account that must be followed, that must be the starting point of the reconstruction, even though we have proven in our previous video that this was a legacy of propaganda. The Poetic Edda is his source. The Poetic Edda is our source, and understanding it is the key to rebuilding the ways of our forebears. Within the text itself, biblical theories have been pushed to equate the gods with negative connotations, and when secularized, they have allowed scholars to cherry-pick the lore and dismiss what they do not like as Christian. Here is what we need to know about the biblical school. Its purpose: to compare heathen poetry with biblical passages in order to establish the notion that our ancestors had to have borrowed their mythos and culture. This is based upon the bias that these people were savages and barbarians that could not have created a complex belief system, and thus had to look at more civilized people in order to create anything resembling a philosophical structure. Its litmus: any resemblance to any Bible passage must be viewed as Christian in origin, while all differences are ignored. No matter how far-fetched or spurious the similarities are, no matter how much the differences outweigh the similarities, these correlations must always equal causation. Its results: although soundly defeated in its inception, the theories promoted by the biblical school have continued to be peppered throughout scholarship as though they are valid, allowing Christians and secularists alike to use the method to cherry-pick the sources and support almost any stance. This has led many heathens to believe that they do not have a religious source, or that we must look to the Christian euhemerists for an understanding of the ancient ways. By further understanding the qualities of these schools, we will continue to unravel the many layers of confusion that have developed over the years within the study of the ancient sources of our people. The idea is to get you to question and seek the answers yourself, rather than tell people how to believe. We feel that as we move forward in this series, the viewer will take notice of the methods handed down and start to critically review the ideas that many feel are set in stone. For more information on the Norna Society, visit our website, www.norna.org, or follow us on Facebook, VK, or MeWe. If you are interested in joining us, you can email us at nornasociety@gmail.com for a free PDF of our membership guide. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and keep up with the latest discoveries and discussions.